Here we go. So our unintentionally timely question for this week is, why have Jews been persecuted by Christians? And I wanted to make sure that I phrased this right, because Jews were persecuted by Christians in the past, but as we know, they continue to be persecuted by many different groups, including Christians today. And so I chose have been in that kind of ongoing sense of the past, speaking to and informing what is happening in the present. And we'll learn a lot about that today. So as usual, we'll start with our assumptions. I just want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page with this before we jump in. I don't think that there are, I couldn't think of anything within the question itself that needs to be addressed, but I want to just make sure that everybody, understands that when we ask questions like this, we're not asking, for excuses. We're not asking, why has this happened? Well, because they did X, Y, Z, and so it's okay that it's happening. That's not what we're trying to do here. And that's pretty obvious, but I just want to make sure that that's out there. When we ask a question like this, we're asking for background for the purpose of avoiding more of it in the future, or at least I hope that most people would ask the question for that reason and not so that they could feel better about themselves or apologize for or excuse current and past behaviors of people that they associate with. And again, on this week, just like last week, I want to make sure that I reiterate that I'm not an expert on this topic, and I just want to always tread very lightly when talking about faith traditions that I am not part of. So this one's a little bit less touchy because it's not about what Jews themselves believe, but more about what Christians believe about Jews. But I think that the experience that Jews have is something that I will never be able to fully understand. And so if you know people who are Jewish, if you have friends, I think it's always appropriate in the aftermath of something like what happened this past week to reach out and say, hey, are you okay? How are you feeling about this thing that happened? The trauma that people experience just from hearing about these types of things over and over and over can be pretty debilitating. And just for them to know that somebody out there who isn't Jewish thinks about that and understands that can be really helpful.
Oh, good point.
So what we're going to do today is kind of run through a history of the relationship between Jews and Christians. There are lots of different pathways that we could have taken with this, and I want you to obviously kind of keep in mind that Jews have had and continue to have relationships with people who don't associate themselves with Christianity over the course of time, but because the question was about Christians, I'm focusing specifically on that. Additionally, though, when we talk about how Christians interact with Jews and the assumptions that Christians make, we also have to remember that even people who live in, for example, modern America, who are not Christians, don't assume that they are Christians, don't say that they're Christians, even know very little about Christianity, because Christianity was so dominant for such a long time in Western culture. The assumptions that Christianity had and developed about Jews kind of became part of the secular culture of like a country like America. And so when we ask questions like, why have Christians persecuted Jews, we're also kind of asking, why do Americans generally, or why do Italians, or why do French, or why do Germans, because that relationship of Christianity with the secular culture is still there, and those assumptions that we make. So that's all I have for assumptions. Anybody else have anything that they want to make sure we keep in mind as we're having this conversation today?
Pretty good.
Okay. All right, so let's jump in. We're actually going to start before the Christians arrive on the scene, because we need to get a little bit of background. So talking a little bit about relationships to the relationship of Jews to non-Jews before Christianity. Because long before Jesus walked the earth, long before Christianity became its own religion, the Jewish people were interacting with non-Jews across the Mediterranean world. It started even before the Babylonian captivity. We've got Israel as a nation that interacted with other nations and traded, and we have even examples of interactions like when Solomon fell in love with the Queen of Sheba in the Bible. So there are interactions with foreign entities throughout the the whole Bible, with Canaanites and Philistines and all kinds of different stuff. But when the Babylonian captivity occurred, when Israel, or when Judah was conquered by the Babylonians and the people were forced into exile, that was a time when there was a lot more of that interaction, because it wasn't mostly the interactions of a Jewish national person who lived in Israel interacting with somebody from outside. Now we're living among each other. We're communicating with each other on a daily basis. We're trading with each other. We're living all over the Babylonian Empire in different towns and places. And so this is kind of where that interaction between Jews and non-Jews starts to blossom out. And then when the Persians, when King Cyrus took over the Babylonian Empire and allowed the Jews to return to the Palestinian area, many of them didn't. And it makes sense. You go into exile and you establish a new life in a place, and you're happy there, and your family's there, and your children have never known any other home. And so maybe you just decide that this is okay. This is life now. But you want to maintain your Jewish identity, the practices that have developed in terms of how you practice Judaism away from the Holy Land, away from the temple. But that's okay. You kind of adapted to that. And so you just keep on rolling as you're doing. And so that's where you get a lot of these.
Go ahead. Ouch.
A lot of these communities that are heavily Jewish outside of Palestine, or what we now would call the country Israel. Then the next kind of big military and political step that occurs is that the Persians are conquered by the Greeks. Alexander the Great, I'm sure you've heard of, came in and conquered the entire known world, and including the land of Israel and all the different places that the Jews had been living in the Jewish diaspora up to that point. And after he conquered everything, he died with no heir. And so what happened after Alexander died was that his empire was divided into 4 parts. Probably should have brought you a map for this, but I didn't think of it until just now. So that was divided into 4 parts, and the 2 parts that are of interest to our conversation today are the Ptolemaic part of the empire and the Seleucid part of the empire. So the Ptolemaic part of the empire is basically Egypt, and the Seleucid part of the empire is the Greeks, but they've kind of got a lot more land than they currently have in terms of what we call Greece today. The Greek Empire covered what we would now consider to be modern day Iraq and Iran. And so if you think about what that map looks like, you've got your Mediterranean Sea oval in the center, and then you've got your Egypt on the south, and you've got your Greece on the north. And the land that you have to fight with each other, to kind of access each other, is from the western edge of the Mediterranean Sea out, the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea out toward out toward the east into what we would now call Saudi Arabia. But most of that is all desert. You don't want to take your army through there. You want to stay close to the sea so that you've got access to the supplies that you need for your troops, so you can, take crops from people and animals, and let your generals stay in a house and not in a tent in the middle of the desert. And so as the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are battling each other over the course of centuries, back and forth, it's the poor Jews, it's the people who live in that little strip of good land, that are constantly getting trampled, constantly getting attacked. And so during that period, a lot of Jews chose to leave or felt like they were being forced to leave. Because, if you've got like your little farm and you plant your crops and you're kind of plodding along as a peasant, and then every 5 years or something, another army comes sweeping through and takes all your crops and, steals all your chickens and all your all your stuff, and maybe, takes your children into slavery for the, for good measure. Eventually you just can't start over again. And so people started to move away. They were in search of more economic stability, and they were in search of more social stability. And so this is where you start to see very large populations of Jews outside of the area of Israel, like, for example, Alexandria. Often it was the Seleucids who had physical control of the Judean province. And so the people would escape to Egypt, because Egypt often would kind of use the people of Israel and try to coddle them a little bit so that they would support their side of the war effort, which wasn't too hard because the Greeks were the ones who were, oppressing them the most. And so a lot of people moved to Alexandria, which was a city in the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. And from there, they could very easily get on ships and would start to go out across the Mediterranean. And so then you actually start to get a large Jewish population in Rome. And on the right bank of the Tiber was where the Jews started to establish themselves. And that's where the Jewish quarter in Rome started. So the Jews, by the time the Roman Empire conquered Judea and made it a province and put King Herod the Great in place as the puppet king, Romans had been interacting with Jews for over 100 years, and not just, on the peripheries, right there in the heart of the Roman Empire in Rome itself. And so the Romans didn't really like the Jews. They were different. They were weird. They lived differently. They had odd mannerisms and behaviors and limitations on their diets and things like that. So there was a lot of people would immigrate on purpose and go from Alexandria to Rome, but then many others would be taken into slavery from other places in the empire, and then they would get to Rome, and their masters would just be so fed up with their weird, odd behavior that they would just free them, so that they were rid of them, and then they would go and they would join the Jewish quarter in Rome. And so that's where we get a lot of the people who were living in the Roman Empire during this period. And so by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, there's tension and unease between the Romans and the Jews, but there's not any open revolt at this point. The Hasmonean dynasty, the one that I talked about last week with Judas Maccabeus establishing independence for the Jewish people, ended in 37 BC. And so it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years by the time Jesus is an adult, closer to 50, 60 years since that battle was won by the Romans. And so Jews are kind of tolerated with a grain of salt. They're allowed to practice their religion as long as it doesn't represent a threat to the Roman authority and control of the region. Now, one thing I want to point out, because a lot of times you'll hear this or read this when you're thinking about the relationship between Jews and Christians in the early church. The Jewish historian Josephus, and he's one of the ones that we have a lot of our information about what life was like for Jews and for Christians, even in the early days of Christianity. This Jewish historian Josephus, he claims that Jews enjoyed what he calls a special status in the Roman Empire. It's called religio licita, or like how we have the word illicit. Illicit is illegal, licit is legal, and so it translates as permitted religion. So he seems to claim that at the time the Romans kind of had a list of religions that were allowed, and then everybody else was, fair game for oppression and persecution. But scholars actually who study these things say that Josephus kind of made that up, because there's no such thing as that kind of status. Either you are a citizen or you're not, you have rights or you don't in terms of that. It's not about the religion that you practice and whether you have the right to practice it. Instead, most of the rights and privileges that Jews enjoyed at this time were bestowed based on individual requests that came to the emperor from certain enclaves, certain communities, certain locations, and were enforced unevenly throughout the empire. So there was just a constant political struggle for status and stability, and just, the ability to live without fear, without being persecuted by locals, by the local government, by anybody that came through town. And that was just kind of how life was. So I know that was a lot. Any questions or anything up to that point? That's just kind of the background to get you a sense of where the Jews are before they even meet the Christians, because there aren't any Christians yet.
Oh, it's good.
Karen, I think you're muted.
It was more of a territorial thing then, of, like conflicts between countries and stuff that have been going on, or between tribes and stuff that have been going on forever. The Jews just were a different tribe or a different country kind of thing.
Not really by this point. Originally, when you think about like the times of King David and stuff, they had that kind of political power. But by the time you get to the Romans, they have a homeland, and many of them live there. But as different people left for different reasons, or were taken away for different reasons, it's kind of like what we see in cities nowadays. You've got like the Chinese quarter or Chinatown, or you've got the French Quarter, or you've got where all the Polish people ended up living, or you've got the place where all the Italians are.
Okay.
It's kind of like that as people would come to these cities, they would find their people that they understood each other, they spoke the same language, they had the same culture, and so they would kind of live together in a group. But they didn't have any kind of larger political power. And so each individual grouping, each Chinatown, so to speak, each, Jewish quarter had to work with its own local government to try to get rights and status and stability. They would petition to the emperor to, stop any kind of really negative stuff that might have been happening locally that was harming them, things like that. But there was not any kind of legitimate leadership. At this point, the only person that would be considered the king of the Jews is Herod, but he's a puppet. He doesn't have any actual power. It's really the Roman governor at the time who has the power to make decisions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so then we move into Jesus coming on the scene. And when we have Jesus, when we put Jesus up against Jews, it just makes no sense, because Jesus, of course, was a Jew. We talked about that last week. But not only that, Jesus also was very explicit in his ministry, and in the Bible, we have evidence that Jesus felt that his call, his job that God was giving him was specifically for the Jews. And the story that that is most telling of this is the story of, in one version, the Syrophoenician woman, in this version, the Canaanite woman. This is from Matthew chapter 15. And I've got a couple spots here where I've got spaces that I didn't print everything, but I'll read you this whole story and you can follow along with the important parts here. It says, Jesus left that place, wherever he was before, and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So Jesus tells this woman, "I can't help you. My miracles are for Jews only." And then she actually convinces him otherwise. She convinces him to open up a little bit. And so different scholars, different thinkers, even people like us that just sit around with Bible studies, have tried to understand this, because we have this sense that Jesus being God doesn't change, knows everything and understands everything. And so is this a story about Jesus's mind being changed, or is this a story about Jesus's role as he kind of understands it being redefined by his experience and encounter with this woman? Is he just playing devil's advocate, or trying to get this woman to reveal herself to him? It's impossible to say, because the story doesn't tell us, but it's an interesting place to start when we're thinking about this question of what is the relationship of Christians to Jews, because it seems to me like, at least up until a certain point in his ministry, Jesus felt that he was there to work with the Jews, to help them to better understand the covenant that God had already made with them, and wasn't really thinking that his personal role would be in relationship to expanding anything out to Gentiles, but that the whole people of Israel as a group would continue to be that blessing, like we talked about last week, to the people through the blessings that God gives to them as the special people of God. So interesting place to start when we're thinking about two different groups that are kind of opposed to each other in this persecution relationship. But it seems like the person that kind of founded, or is the main player in one of them in Christianity, feels like he's actually supposed to be on the other side. So then moving forward in kind of the biblical history with the early church, it's important to mention that what Paul's missionary outreach looked like. We don't talk a lot about this, and it's an interesting thing. Maybe we can have that be one of our conversations for the future, one of our questions for the future. Kind of what did it look like to be a Christian in the early church, and kind of look at some of the Acts stuff. But for the purposes of this conversation, this question, I just wanted to point out how many times the text of Acts lets us know that the first stop that Paul makes anytime he arrives at a new place is the synagogue. In Acts 9, he goes to Damascus, and it says that he goes to the synagogue to preach. In Acts 13, there are two different places that he goes to the synagogue first. Acts 14, Acts 17, Acts 18, all these places that are mentioned, the first place that Paul goes is to the synagogue. And so Paul understood his mission to be to all people. And over the course of time, which we'll see in a minute, he kind of started to push his attention more toward the Gentiles because he wasn't making headway with the Jews. But for Paul, I think it makes sense because, you know, he's Jewish and he's coming to a new town. And what do you do when you come into a new town? You try to find your people. You try to make connections with people that might be sympathetic to you, help you to find a place to stay, help you to, you know, figure out how you're going to make a living while you're there, on, you know, doing what it is that you're doing. And so all of these times that Paul goes to the synagogue to preach the good news of Jesus indicates that, at least from somebody's perspective, this is not a separate mission. This is just as much about the Jews as it is about the Gentiles, if not more, because it starts with the Jewish people. But then over the course of time, Paul starts to feel like he is a failure. He's failing in his mission to spread this message out to the Jews. And so I want to look with you at two passages from Romans chapters 9 through 11. This is the famous Jews versus Gentiles section of Paul's writings, where everybody goes to try to understand what's going on with the Jews, because this is the question that Paul is wrestling with. So at the beginning of this section, Paul says, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my own people, my kindred according to the flesh. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs." And then he goes on. And so Paul is really upset by the fact that his people are not coming into this understanding of Christ and Jesus as the Messiah, and buying into his interpretation of this guy's life. Because he says, you know, all of this relationship with God belongs to them. And this new thing that God is doing, or this, you know, method that God is using to take a step forward in that relationship with us, I don't understand why the people aren't buying it, aren't getting it. And so he goes on through the next 3 chapters talking about this and what it means and how he can understand what's happening here. And the conclusion that he comes to at the very end of chapter 11 is that so that you may not claim to be wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, out of Zion will come the deliverer. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And so for Paul, the idea is that he can logically understand why the Jewish people, or at least part of Israel, he says, do not accept the truth of who Jesus is. Because by having them reject it, it opens up a space for Gentiles to come in, for Gentiles to accept it. And then he thinks that once the full number of Gentiles have accepted it, then the rest of the Jews will come around and they too will fall into place where, into the same place where he is. And so that's kind of his understanding of the relationship. So there's still, for Paul, even though he ends up making most of his missionary work to Gentiles, there's still this sense that that the Jews are part of it. The Jews are still part of the plan. The Jews are still important to what God is doing in the world. But we have to be careful, I think, sometimes when we think about the implications of this, because the Bible itself, as we've seen in the past, is not a history book. It's not a neutral statement of what's happening or why it's happening. It is political. It is making a point. It's trying to convince you of something. And so there, just as there is in anything that we say to each other when we're trying to convince each other of something, there is a sense of propaganda. And when I say that word, I don't mean it in the nasty way that, it's been used for, like, example, World War II propaganda, where they would take sheets of paper and throw them out the plane to try to, turn people against whoever it was that they were vilifying that day, with all of the, over exaggerations and stuff. When I say propaganda, I just mean that it is the natural act of using the information that is useful to you and not using the information that is not useful to you when you're trying to make your argument. So, for example, in Romans chapter 10, which is in the heart of this conversation that Paul is having with the Romans about what to do about the Jews, he says, "But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him?" And so he's talking about, how important it is that people who do follow the way, follow Jesus, need to tell other people about it. They need to tell the Jews. And so we kind of have this sense that Jews heard about this stuff and they either accepted it and became Christians, or they rejected it. But that's actually not historically accurate. According to some scholars, in the first century Roman Empire, so during this time that Christianity was starting to develop, there were as many as 7 million Jews living all across the Roman world, all across the empire around the Mediterranean. And I think, the reality is that very few of the Palestinian Jews, the people who were right there, living in the same region as Jesus, knew very much about Jesus at all. And most of the ones that were living outside of Palestine knew nothing of Jesus until Paul showed up and tried to start talking to the synagogues about it. And so if you think about, all the different little towns that would have existed in this huge empire, there would have been some that, Paul could have gotten to and shared this information with, and maybe a handful of people would have said, "Oh yeah, I get what you're saying." And there are examples of those people in the book of Acts. Others would say, no, you're crazy. That's not the Messiah. There, it's XYZ. Tells us who the Messiah is. And, kind of rolling forward like that. But one person is not going to be able to express all of this news to 7 million people. And granted, Paul is not the only one doing this, but you see what I'm trying to get at here. We kind of assume that by the time Christianity and Judaism start to separate, that all the Jews know what Christianity is and understand that they're taking a side here. But that's just not true. The Gospels, I think, suggest, especially when we get to, the really hardcore stuff in Luke and then John, that all Jews had actively rejected Jesus. But that suggestion is early church propaganda. It's a sign of the Jewish politics of the time that are, happening within the Jewish communities, because there are Jews who say, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. And then there are people who say, no, he's not. And the people who are writing these Gospels are the ones who are on the side of Jesus. And so they want to, kind of pile on to their opponents to show how wrongheaded they are. And this is what gets codified into our Bible. This political argument that's happening within Jewish circles. So we have to be careful when we read and the assumptions that we make about, even the knowledge that the Jewish people as a whole, 7 million people, probably, a few thousand at the most, had even heard of Jesus at the point that the tide starts to turn. And boy, does the tide turn. It doesn't really just turn, but it swells rapidly. So I'm calling this part maybe political tsunami, because the tide it's not just tide, it's completely ridiculous. The first thing that happens is that everything changes in 70 CE. The Jews started a revolt in the year 66, and the general who eventually became Emperor Vespasian, he stamps it out by invading Jerusalem and destroying the temple. So the second temple is completely razed to the ground, and it's gone. And so from here on, from this time on, it is politically better to distance yourself from Judaism rather than to use it as a shield from political investigation. So people, like I said, the Romans at this point, up to this point, they knew who the Jews were. They kind of found them annoying and weird. But generally speaking, they tolerated them with, low levels of localized persecution and oppression. But when you get to 70, everything changes. No longer do the Jews enjoy any kind of protections, even the little that they had before. And so if you're a new experience of religion that's growing before 70, you can kind of say, oh yeah, we're part of the Jewish thing, yeah, they're not, your favorite people, but you tolerate them, and so we're going to kind of, latch on to the coattails of that. But when you hit 70, now the tide turns. You really don't want to be associated with that at all. And so the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John especially have extensive evidence of this attempt at distancing. And it makes sense, if the Jews are the target of the power that be, then they could say, well, you Christians, you're, the person that you worship was a Jew, and so obviously you're Jews too. But if you put into the book, well, yes, of course, our Jesus was a Jew. We can't argue that. But look, his own people rejected him and had him killed. And so that's why we are not Jews. We are distancing ourselves from this. We are not Jews anymore because look, the Jews rejected him. The Jews rejected us. We have nothing to do with any of that. And so you get stuff that's really heavy, to the point that it's like John chapter 19. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So there's a lot of evidence in the Bible of, this inter-Jewish argumentation, that the Jews are trying to figure out if they're going to accept Jesus as the Messiah or not. And then you have this second level of all the writings that were written after 70, where people who are now trying to distance themselves from the Jewish people, whether they were former Jews who now are trying to, make Christianity its own thing, or whether they were Gentiles who kind of came into the Christian fold, trying to separate themselves and distance themselves from Jews. You get this very strong language against the Jews that ends up in these writings, that we kind of lose that context, but the content is still there. So let me stop there and see what questions or comments you have.
It's complicated.
It is, and it's only going to get worse.
I mean, last week, I was just blown away by some of this stuff, and now this week, you're piling it on again.
Always, Karen.
That's good.
Yeah.
So now we start to move out of the kind of biblical period and into what we would call, not quite early medieval history, but kind of late antiquity. So we talked about the year 70. 70 was the year that so much changed. But another year that's really important is 135. Around the year 135, two very important things happened in relationship to the Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity. The first thing that happened in 135 was that there was another Jewish uprising. And this time, the Roman emperor, or the Roman general Julius Severus, came to Judea, and he absolutely destroyed the entire region. The Jewish population of Judea was basically wiped out. Either by everybody was killed, they were sold into slavery, they escaped as refugees, with the Romans on their tails. Everybody was pretty much gone. And this is the point when Jews no longer have that homeland, that sense of Israel being the place that is their space, that's safe for them. After this, Jews were not allowed to be in Jerusalem except for one day a year. And that day that they allowed them to be there was the day that they remembered the destruction of the temple, which of course is a helpful propaganda tool, because if you allow people to come to a place they're not welcome any other time, just to help them to remember what the Romans did to them when they revolted, that will keep them thinking about the consequences of that revolt and prevent them from revolting again from wherever it is they're living now. So Jews are no longer allowed to live in Jerusalem after 135. So at this point, most of the Jews in the world are Jews who live outside of Israel proper. They're people who live in Alexandria and Rome and other places around the empire. Additionally, not exactly in this year, but this is approximately the time that our New Testament canon began to come together. There are lists of the books that are included in what these what leaders in the church about this time felt would fit into it, and it's familiar to us. It's recognizable to us as what the canon eventually became. And so it's about the same time. So just as the Jews are losing everything, Christians are widely starting to read these works that include these vitriolic interpretations of the evils of Jews in the Gospels. And so you can see that things are starting to kind of turn upside down. By the year 380, early church leaders reached the point where they are fully immersed in this view of Jews as the enemy of Christ. We have evidence of this, for example, when Christianity is made the official state religion by Theodosius I. He declared Christianity the official state religion of the empire. And by this point, Christians vastly dominated the populations of Jews everywhere because of the Roman oppression of the Jews over the course of these several hundred years, and because of the spread of Christianity among Gentiles throughout the empire. So Christians are growing and becoming a greater number, and Jews are shrinking because of the persecutions by the Romans. But even so, Theodosius, in declaring Christianity the official state religion, wanted to pass some laws that kind of protected the rights of people who were not Christians, including Jews. And there was a bishop, his name is Ambrose, not to be mixed up with Ambrose of Milan. This one is Ambrose of Mediolanum, something like that. These long words. And so he expresses opposition to Theodosius' plan to give Jews and pagans civil rights under this new Christian regime. And here's what he says. He says, "Whom do they, that is the Jews, have to avenge the synagogue? Christ, whom they have killed, whom they have denied? Or will God the Father avenge them, who they did not acknowledge as Father, since they do not acknowledge the Son?" And so here is some early evidence of Christians having power and using that power to interpret the Jews in the way that helps them to justify persecuting them. Christ, whom they have killed, whom they have denied. So this is the first time that we see the Jews as God killer developing. And this is codified in our Bible. The same story that I just read you from the Gospel of John about Pilate and the people and Jesus being tried before Pilate appears also in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's even more vitriolic. Matthew chapter 27, verses 24 to 25 say, "So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.' Then the people as a whole answered, 'His blood be on us and our children.'" And so even though the Catholic Church, as it developed in these early stages and even later into the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church never officially codified this interpretation or this opinion of Jews. It was never officially a position, but it was common knowledge that the Jewish people hold collective guilt for the murder of Jesus. That's just kind of an assumption that people made starting at this point. When you talk about a Jew, you're talking about somebody who killed God.
Wait. Just one sentence. Why?
Because of this passage right here. His blood be on us and our children.
Mhm.
So if I'm a Jew,
that just seems like a leap.
it is, but that's how they chose to interpret it. So if I am a Jew living in the year 200 in Rome, I am personally responsible for the death of Jesus because
Just
of this.
because this person said so?
Yes.
They didn't even have social media, Katie.
Of course, not only the leap here, but also, we're ignoring the part where Jesus needed to die anyway. So even if Jews are God killers, isn't that them helping God's plan along here?
That's another discussion.
That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of stuff that we're ignoring because we want this to say what we want it to say, right? Which is how the Bible's always been used.
Why haven't we changed? It's been 2,000 years.
Nope.
Why are we still doing this?
We are still doing this. So, we're kind of moving from late antiquity into the early medieval period, and most of the records from this period, there aren't very many, but most of the records from this period seem to indicate that there is kind of an uneasy coexistence between Jews and Christians during this period, similar to how it was with the Roman Empire. The Christians have the upper hand, they have the power, they have the ability to accept or deny particular legislation, to give or take away rights from Jews. And so Jews are just kind of still living in the precarious position that they've been in for thousands of years in relationship to all of these empires around them. But generally speaking, there's not any organized oppression or persecution. It's just kind of localized. Not that that's good. It's still bad that there's persecution, but this knowledge of Jews as God killers is just kind of an accepted thing, but it's not used in a wider way up to about the year 1000. So when you get to the year 1000, that's approximately when the Crusades began. And so now you've got reasons to start hating on Jews. And so you start to see frequent, ongoing, but they're still mostly local attacks and indignities, always with the accusation that Jews deserve these indignities and attacks because they're God killers. But before 1000, it's not really, really huge. And I think we have to consider, where some of this hate and distrust might come from. So there's the theological thing. There's his blood be on us and our children. You killed our God. There's that. But there's other stuff too. So the Jews were excluded from the larger society because of the theology, but also because they behaved differently. Their customs involved much more cleanliness than was practiced by Christians for many centuries. And so Jews succumbed to various plagues and diseases at much lower rates than Christians did, because they washed themselves as part of their purity rituals. They didn't eat certain things because of their purity rituals. And so that helped to protect them from some of the grossness of what it was like to, to be an average person, not understanding that, washing yourself helps to keep you free from disease, and things like that. So there's that they are weird, they act weird, they seem to benefit from some kind of magic that we don't understand, that doesn't hurt them. But because the Jews were excluded from the larger society, because their behavior was different, they were forced to live in community with each other, develop their own economies, develop their own relationships, and those economies and relationships flourished. And so if this is a group of people that you're looking down on, that you're trying to exclude on purpose, and they're actually flourishing as their separate group, you're going to resent that, right? You're going to be angry about that. And so a lot of that hate that starts with theology turns into economic distrust and hate. It turns into social distrust and hate. And so all of these things are kind of swirling together in the way that Christians and Jews are interacting with each other on the local level. But then when we hit the year 1000, not only is it this local stuff, but now we're adding extra kind of umbrella issues on top of it. And this is when we start to see the shift from what we would call anti-Judaism, which is based on theology, to anti-Semitism as we understand it today, which is based on a kind of combination of religious and ethnic identity that is really difficult to define, but has to do with connection to people who are Jews. And we talked last week about who is a Jew, what is a Jew, which is already really complicated. And so some of the things that occurred that caused additional animosity and additional wider persecutions of Jews are, first of all, xenophobia and the Crusades. So when the Muslims kind of encountered Europe with military might, and they started to battle with each other over property, over theological superiority. So now there's this sense across Europe that we are at war with the other. Anybody who's different is suspect, and we've ourselves seen this. Whenever there's a war, whenever there's a disagreement, we automatically go after those people who are local, who look like our enemy or act like our enemy, or are just not us. Who are you? Are you one of us? Or are you one of them? Well, I'm not really either of them because I'm Jewish, but do with that what you will, because I can't convince you either way. So you have a lot of that going on because of the Crusades. But then we have other stuff going on. The Middle Ages had a lot of major climate shifts. There were several kind of mini, what do they call them? Mini
the mini ice ages?
Ice ages, yes, thank you. Mini ice age. All I can think of was glacier, and I knew that was wrong. Like the mini ice ages where the climate would shift, things got colder, the crops were not doing as well, all that kind of stuff. And when people are experiencing economic instability, they're looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for some way to control the uncontrollable. And so Jews were a perfect target because they were different, they were weird, they were benefiting somehow more than we were in a lot of situations, and we resented that. And so we could kind of pile on our resentment onto the Jews and blame them for things that are out of our control to make us feel a little bit better about ourselves. And then lastly, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Because Jews isolated themselves a lot of times and were forced into doing that because they weren't welcome in society, and because of their purity rituals, it kept them safer from the plague. And so they were often accused of spreading the plague, of being the source of the plague, deliberately poisoning wells. You have to remember, these people didn't understand what the plague was and where it was coming from. And so they were looking for any reason and any way to protect themselves. And when they saw that the Jews weren't dying in as large a number, and of course they already have it out for them, then they say, oh, well, because you're not dying, so that means that you're targeting us. You're the one that's causing this. You're poisoning our water, or you're, sprinkling us with some kind of magical plague dust, or whatever it is that you're using to cause this. You are doing this. And so all of this leads to a ton of widespread banishment, expulsion, persecution, death. In 1290, all Jews were banished from England. Everybody Jewish was kicked out of the country. In 1396, 100,000 Jews were banished from France. There was the decimation. They completely just destroyed communities that were flourishing on the Rhine and the Danube in the Germanic area. There was no Germany at this point, of course, but that kind of region. And many of the persecuted and expelled Jews during this period went to Poland. And because there were several noblemen there who saw in these expelled Jews an economic opportunity, because the Jews were often in the money lending business. They were in finance. Why? Because there were so many laws that prevented Jews from taking up different trades, prevented Jews from owning land, that money lending was really the only thing that was not forbidden to them, because Christians saw money lending as socially inferior. A Christian wasn't supposed to lend money at interest to another Christian. And so they would leave that to the Jews. And so that would be really the only job that they could take up. And so the stereotype of greed is where that comes from. But these Polish noblemen, they thought, oh, well, all these Jews who are in finance and understand the economy are coming, are trying to find a place to live. Well, I'm going to take them in because they're going to help me to make a ton of money. And so they brought them in, and that's why Poland ended up with a pretty large population of Jews. Additionally, in a little bit later period, under Catherine the Great, who ruled for a really long time in Russia, she was friendly to the Jews. And so when they would leave Western Europe, they would come into Eastern Europe and go to Russia, and Catherine would protect them. Unfortunately, as these different leaders who were friendly to Jews died, now we've got these huge Jewish populations, and the people again are resenting them and want to figure out what to do about them. And so after Catherine died, the program of pogroms and the ghettoization of Jews became part of the policy of the Russian Empire. And similarly in Poland, they kind of turned the tide on them. And this is not just limited to Europe. In the Middle East, there was a lot of persecution of Jews because they were different. It wasn't quite as bad in a lot of places because they actually followed their holy scriptures that told them that they were to treat Jews with respect because they were part of the same family of faiths. But in a lot of places throughout Europe and throughout the Middle East, Jews were required to wear yellow badges on all of their clothing to designate themselves as ethnic or religious outsiders. And that might sound familiar to you, wearing a yellow badge to designate yourself as a Jew. So this is throughout the Middle Ages. This is common, so that you can know who you can pick on if you're in a bad mood that day and not get in trouble for it. All right, so this is another good spot for us to pause, see what comments and questions we have at this point.
It just seems to have mushroomed after, it started out kind of small, and then they just got blamed for everything, and it seems so unfair when you look at it from our perspective, but you can understand how these uneducated people around them just needed scapegoats. I mean, they couldn't have any other, they didn't understand anything about science or anything like that to have any other explanation. And why not blame it on the person, the people who killed God?
Right. If you've already
Yeah.
got it out for somebody, then it's really easy to just kind of pile on more and more on them, especially because there's kind of evidence there, right? You know, they're not getting sick. They're not dying in the same numbers as we are. No, you know, never mind that it's because we make them live over there and so they're not exposed to it like we are in our community over here.
Yeah.
Never mind that we're the ones that caused them to be safer than us.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's odd somebody didn't figure that out.
I'm
mean,
sure they did. They just
All
didn't
the white
care.
people
You know,
were totally
they
stupid.
wanted it to be that way, you know. So when potential evidence that's against what you believe comes up, what do? You chuck it out until you can't chuck it out anymore because it's too overwhelming.
But you know, it's the same with every ethnic group that we have today. I mean, people always, I've always thought, well, you know, I grew up in the South and I've always felt like, I'm sorry, I'm getting phone, my son tested positive for COVID and I'm getting phone calls in between all this stuff. But it was like the poor white people had to have somebody that was lower on the totem pole than they were. And that turned out to be the blacks. And so it's like people always look for somebody to blame or somebody who they don't feel is as good as they are or something to blame all the misfortune on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just horrible. I mean, instead of thinking, well, this is just life and things like this happen, to blame a whole race of people for something like that, it's just ridiculous.
That's easier to take though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Easier to swallow the idea that there is an active enemy that I can fight than it is to just understand that, you know, it is what it is and you got to accept it and work through it as best you can.
Right. Well, the whole basic Christianity of loving one another and, you know, everybody being in this pot together, that just goes by the wayside.
Very easily, yes. All right. Well, unfortunately, we're not quite done yet. So we come to the Reformation and our friend Martin Luther. So Luther, early on in his work and his thinking, was convinced that Jews would come around when he exposed them to his quote unquote correct version of the gospel. And so I want to read to you a little excerpt from his 1523 treatise, That Christ Was Born a Jew. I just love this because he's Martin Luther, so he's got all these lovely words that he likes to use. So he says, if I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When we are inclined to boast of our position as Christians, we should remember that we are but Gentiles, while the Jews are of the lineage of Christ. We are aliens and in-laws. They are blood relatives, cousins and brothers of our Lord. Therefore, if one is to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews are actually nearer to Christ than we are. If we really want to help them, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. If some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? After all, we ourselves are not all good Christians either.
Wow.
So that sounds reasonable, right?
Blockheads. It's really right in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's Luther. He tells it like it is, right? But I think he was kind of onto something there. He said, well, if we're treating them terribly, of course they're not going to convert. Why would you convert to the religion of somebody that's persecuting you and treating you awfully? Maybe show them a little love and then they'll come around. But over the course of the next 20 years, when that didn't work, when the Jews did not come flocking to Lutheranism, Luther started to get angry. And by 1543, he was writing on the Jews and their lies. And this is the famous diatribe of Luther that ended up being used by Hitler to support some of his policies toward the Jews. So I'll read you a piece of this and you can compare, the difference 20 years makes. He says, "What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach, henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of a young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. But if we are afraid that they might harm us or our wives, children, servants, cattle, etc., then let us emulate the common sense of other nations, such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., and eject them forever from the country." So this is what Luther suggests.
Well, I don't like that.
No, that was not good.
I don't like that at all.
Yeah. He must have been really disappointed that they didn't just come flocking into the church.
He was. He was.
Well, he was kind of a hard guy too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Very black and white.
pretty rigid. Yeah.
Yes.
But
So this is, this is the kind of rhetoric that helped to, move things even further forward in the persecution of the Jews.
Well, yeah.
Have you read anything about the church in Germany and how that could have helped Hitler, or were people just ignoring it and hoping it'd all go away?
I mean, so the Lutheran Church, the main line churches in Germany were on board with Hitler. If you were not on board with Hitler, you were part of the confessing church movement, and there were not very many of them.
That really stinks.
Politics are really scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's why it
almost
shouldn't
done.
be mixed up with the politics, and theology shouldn't be mixed up like that.
Well, they are. I don't think we have a choice for them to be mixed up, but we have to get them straight, right?
I know. We talked about that.
All right. So we move into the modern era, so to speak, here. And oh no, I didn't put my notes in this slide. No. All right, let me see if I can pull it up, because I have some dates and stuff I wanted to share with you. So we get to, kind of we've established these stereotypes about what a Jew is in our minds. Not because they're fair, not because they're accurate, but because they have been around for so long that we just kind of assume them, that we don't question them, we don't ask questions, we don't ask, hey, where did this come from, or why is this the case? And it makes it really easy because Jews are ghettoized. They're isolated from the rest of us. And so we don't have an opportunity to say, hey, that Jewish kid that sits next to me at lunch is not a greedy troll-like creature. Maybe some of this stuff is wrong. We don't have those kinds of opportunities because we keep them away from us. So all of this kind of stuff is pretty well established into the culture. Different things like here's a good example of this. Until 1870, so this is almost into 1900, Jews living in what is now Italy were only allowed to live in designated places, which were called ghettos, Jewish ghettos. So that's the kind of stuff that was still going on, even up to into the modern era. Then we get to a good guy named Richard Wagner. You might recognize him as a very famous composer. He is also known as the first modern anti-Semite. He wrote a diatribe in 1850. This was actually written in opposition to his kind of composer rivals, who were both happened to be Jewish, but it then kind of devolved into talking about Jews in general. And so in 1850, he wrote, "According to the present constitution of this world, the Jew in truth is already more than emancipated. He rules and will rule so long as money remains the power before which all our doings and dealings lose their force." So this sense that the Jews have it up on us, the Jews have access to all the money, the Jews are rich, the Jews, have it better. Why is that? That's not fair, because they're the ones that killed God. They're the ones that have been undermining us and stealing from us for centuries, and they deserve to be taken down for all of this. And so then these negative stereotypes of Jews as cunning and money hungry and ugly and evil, they're even codified into children's stories like the Grimm's fairy tales. There are several fairy tales in the Grimm collection that are about Jews, and they're very mythologically depicted. They're evil, ugly, troll-like, or I don't know what other kind of negative, like the opposite of a fairy, I guess, is how Jews are depicted in
ogres and witches. Ogres and witches.
Yeah, stuff like that. That's how they're depicted in written culture, in art, all over the place. And so this is kind of part of the the culture, part of the mindset that people have when it comes to Jews. Then, as time goes on, we start to move toward modern warfare, like World War I. And so then we can talk about Germany. In the period between the wars, between World War I and World War II, Germany had the biggest population of Jews in Europe. And after World War I, Germany's economy was ruined because of their losing this war. And so the Weimar Republic was set up. You might remember some of these words from when you took modern history in high school or college. The Weimar Republic was set up to try to help Germany to recover politically and economically from World War I, but that failed. And unfortunately, the Weimar Republic was highly supported by a lot of prominent Jews of the time. And so there was this young instigator at the time named Adolf Hitler, whose name you might recognize. And he capitalized on this fact and placed blame on the ongoing inflation and economic depression of the late 20s in the lap of the Jewish population, because of these prominent Jews who supported the failed government that was unsuccessful in bringing Germany around from its political and economic ruin, which, to be fair, I don't know who could have, because they had waged a world war and lost. So that's just kind of how things are. And so I don't even need to get into what comes next with the Holocaust and the atrocities of that, but you can see how this kind of just continues to build and build and build. You know, some people would say that this statement is unfair, but I think that it isn't completely false to suggest that you could trace a line directly from this misinterpretation of the Bible and the way that the conversation and the disagreements that were happening as those stories were written and for their political purposes. The misunderstanding of that shaped the way that our relationships as Christians to Jews developed over the course of time, that line can be traced directly from that biblical interpretation to the Holocaust. Not because Hitler believed that Jews were God killers and that was the reason why he was doing this to these people, but because he monopolized on that. He took advantage of the fact that all of this history, all of this development of resentment and anger and scapegoating brought him to this place. And so he could take advantage of that, continue to scapegoat the same group and bring himself to power in that way and convince himself, you know, with his obvious mental problems that he had, but not nearly as heavy of mental problems as we would like, because he's just like us. If you allow yourself to believe that your suffering is the fault of someone else, I think all of us are capable of that. So that's what I wanted to say about the modern era. Comments up to that point?
Do you think anything has changed till today?
No.
None.
Not a thing. Not a thing.
Nothing's changed and it's only going to get worse.
I think so.
No, I think nothing's changed and it's going to keep us unchanged. I mean, things have been so bad in the past over so many different wars. I don't see how, I can see how we can keep repeating it, but I don't see how we can get worse. Please.
Well, so we come back around to our question here. Why have Jews been persecuted by Christians? And I think, we've kind of come to the conclusion that the political and religious arguments that Jewish communities were having in the first century about Jesus and whether he was the Messiah ended up in the Holy Scriptures. But because people over the course of time didn't understand that context, they read and misinterpreted those statements outside of that context. And then as Christian power grew, so did their ability to act on those beliefs. So at first, it wasn't really hurting anything to blame the Jews, right? Because they could believe that, but they had no power to do anything about it. But as Christianity grew and as Christianity gained political power, now we can do something about those beliefs. And then I think additionally, as kind of a secondary element to this, Jewish identity has always been based on their refusal to be absorbed into the mainstream culture. The purpose that God established for the Jewish people as set apart, as holy, as special to God, circumcision, all the different behaviors that Jews continue to live out today is for the purpose of being different dress, different food, different behavior, so that these people can remember that they are God's holy, set apart people. But from the outside looking in at that, it results in anger and frustration and misunderstanding and resentment. If you're trying to feel good about yourself, doesn't it feel good when people do what you're doing or ask you for your advice or, behave the way that you behave? Doesn't that reinforce the legitimacy of that? Even when I think about like choices that I've made and how I raise my children, my mom gets really offended when I do something different than she did with us because, well, what was wrong with what I did? And it's not about that. I'm making my own choices. I'm doing my own thing. But the way that she sees that is as a judgment on her and on the choices that she made as a parent. So there's kind of some of that stuff going on in there too. And so, especially during times of crisis and struggle, either on the individual level or on the national level, then all of this anger and frustration and resentment turns into blame. And that's where we end up with widespread persecutions of Jews. And this is not something that has ever gone away. I think we think about things like what happened last week in the synagogue in Houston, and we say, gosh, isn't that terrible? And we think about it happening with the shooting in Pittsburgh a few years ago and different things like that. But this is actually an ongoing thing that Jews grapple with all the time. I read, because of the Houston thing being in the news, there's been some other stuff, and apparently in the last 2 years, there have been at least 2 nationwide bomb threats against Jewish synagogues every month for the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
They're coordinated by people who get together and say, this is the Saturday that we're gonna threaten. Go to your local closest synagogue and give them this threat. And so it's this ongoing, I think something that we, as non-Jews don't understand is the ongoing trauma, the ongoing danger of being Jewish, just living as a Jewish person, even in America in the year 2022.
Wow.
And so I would hope that asking this question, why have Jews been persecuted by Christians, would lead us to another question. More importantly, what do we do about it? And so I wanted to, just talk for a couple minutes about things like churches like the ELCA issue statements, rejecting past ideas and apologizing for past treatment. But I don't think that paperwork is enough. I was actually pretty surprised by how middling the language is, even from the Lutheran Church. The ELCA is the biggest Lutheran denomination in America. We're a member of the Lutheran World Federation. We've said some really strong stuff about a lot of different things in the past. And so I wanted to see what the Lutheran Church had to say about our relationship as Lutherans to the Jewish community, especially as we, connect to Martin Luther so closely and claim his name in our denomination. And so I went looking. The Lutheran Church has what are called social statements that are approved by the entire body of the church-wide assembly that meets every 3 years. And then they have declarations that are approved just by the church council. So it's not the whole big body that votes, it's just a smaller council. And that is the highest level of statement that the Lutheran Church has about Jews, is a declaration from the church council. And this declaration is called the Declaration of the ELCA to the Jewish Community. And it was approved by the church council in 1994, and then it was readopted with edits in 2021. And I just wanted to read to you kind of what they say is their takeaway from their understanding and their confronting this history of Luther and the support of persecuting Jews. They say, "We recognize in anti-Semitism a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, a violation of our hope and calling, and we pledge this church to oppose the deadly working of such bigotry, both within our own circles and in the society around us." So, I think that's okay. I mean, that's a good thing to say. I'm not criticizing the thing itself, but there's no deep apology. There's no recognition of how these past behaviors and in unintentional or intentional policies and positions have influence today. And I think that's the part that is missing to me. So I think as we're thinking about, what do we do about this? We need to be aware of how these ideas still permeate our own consciousness and the consciousness of the circles that we run in. And I think,
Katie,
Yeah.
Did you know that before the building for Temple Beth Israel was built, the congregation met in our church
I did not know
for a
that.
number of years? Yeah. So,
So you might know a little bit about this,
Yeah.
this next thing that I was going to say, because I think something that helps me to kind of keep aware of that in my own life is to try to be aware of like what everyday life is like for our Jewish neighbors. I follow a lot of different Jewish people, rabbis, people who are involved in Jewish culture and life on Twitter, to just keep up with, what's going on and hearing about things. And so I learned that according to a study done by a Jewish organization in America, every Jewish organization in America, regardless of size, spends on average $75,000 a year on security. So any size synagogue or larger organizations average $75,000 a year. And this, of course, is money that, could be spent on their ministries, to each other, to the community, all the different things that churches do, Jews are doing just from their own theological perspectives, but they have to spend it on security. They have to create cement benches and put them outside of their buildings so that if a car tried to drive into their building, they would hit the cement bollard and not damage the building and the people inside. They have to pay for bulletproof glass in their sanctuaries to keep their people safe while they're worshiping. They have to hire armed guards to put at the door on Saturdays so that they can try to keep people safe. But they still want to be who they're called to be. They want to be welcoming of guests and visitors. But how do you live that every day? How do you go to your worship space every Saturday and think, oh, I'm so glad that you're here. I really hope that you're not going to shoot me. That's life. That's every day. And how does that impact you and impact you psychologically? Just how can we, try to understand that to some degree? I think we need to change how we read and engage with the Bible. I think that how we hold our Bible up as this perfect book that fell out of the sky from God isn't just harmful in a lot of ways to us in the way that we engage it, but it's also has real life consequences. Because if we can't acknowledge that our Bible has human perspectives, human opinions, human interpretations in it, and still give us what God has to say to us today, then the content of the Bible will continue to dictate how, and the interpretations of the past will continue to dictate how we interact with people in the real world. The Bible literally says, may his blood be on us and on our children. And if we read that as a history book, as the facts and only the facts, ma'am, then we take that for what it is. And we say, okay, well, yeah, we're going to go along with this idea that Jews are God killers and that every Jew that I encounter today is personally responsible for the death of Jesus, because that's what our Bible says. But if we loosen up our grip on the Bible a little bit and we accept that gray space that exists for ourselves in the way that we read our Bible, in the way that we interact with God, in the way that we interact with each other, then that also loosens up and allows us to exist in that gray space of the rest of our lives, so that our suffering and our, the negative situations that we find ourselves in as individuals or as communities or as an entire nation doesn't need to find somebody to blame, because life is like that. And can't we, shouldn't we be banding together to address the problems that we're experiencing right now as a nation, rather than point fingers and create more problems? And transition is scary, and I can see in our world right now there are so many people who are just terrified of what it's going to look like tomorrow or next year, but we can't let that fear drive us. We have to speak up and resist the language among our own circles of influence that normalize these ideas that only certain people, only certain behaviors or certain dress styles are truly American and other people aren't. We have to shut down people who use anti-Semitic speech, especially when it's used casually, when the kinds of words that are thrown around that we kind of just let go sometimes, maybe for the sake of our friendships, that kind of thing. And it's hard, it's not easy to try to change 2,000 years of cultural perception of a group. I don't even know if it is possible. So that's where we are.
It's equal. I don't think it's equal everywhere. I don't think there's one straight line of persecution or anti-Semitic thought. So maybe there's hope because of that.
Just looking for the little cracks, I think, in the straight line, to try to wiggle in there and widen them a little bit. Even make one person think.
I always think of my grandkids, because they are so much more accepting and open about differences in people, how people dress, who they fall in love with, all these things that they just don't see as being very important, all these outside things. And so I have a little bit of hope for the future that maybe eventually people will start judging people by their character instead of how they dress or what they, that sort of thing. I have a friend, and I knew her for about 20 years before I knew she was Jewish. It's like, how do you look at somebody and say, oh, they must be Jew, or they must be this or that? I just don't understand that at all either. But I think the young people, at least a lot of them, and that's why they dress so outrageously and everything, is they try to tell us that those outside things don't mean anything. So maybe that'll be the change. I don't know.
The kids are all right.
Yeah. The kids are all right.
So, I usually try to give you some kind of hope to take away with you from these classes. And I had a really hard time with that this week. This is a really hard topic, and it's something that I think we need to keep before us all the time. And it's easy for us as Christians who aren't in it to just kind of forget and go about our business until the next time something comes up in the news cycle, and oh yeah, this is a problem, isn't it? So I just today brought you an excerpt from Psalm 78.
Oh, excuse me.
To remind us of the love that God has for God's chosen people. And we remember that God chose those people not for their own sake, but for the sake of the world. And, Jews of good faith believe that. They believe that they are here to bring blessing to the entire world. And how they do that is through the practice of their religion and through, showing God's love to the world. And, I think that if we can find ways to support that, to accompany that, to walk alongside that, that's a really good place to start. So I want to read to you from Psalm 78. God chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He chose his servant David and took him from the sheepfolds to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart, he tended them and guided them with skillful hand. So if God is the shepherd of these people that God loves, and we claim to love God, then what is our call? What is our role? And that is what I leave you with today.
Very good.
So next week, maybe a little bit less
Oh,
less heavy, but nice and theologically juicy. When did God become triune?
interesting. Thanks, Katie.
Good question. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you Sunday.